At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair eased his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk into a climbing turn above Assam, India, just as 64 Japanese aircraft emerged from the morning haze 3 miles to the east, flying straight toward his base at Dinjan Airfield. Adair was only 23 years old, already a veteran of 43 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, escorting and protecting the Hump airlift. But on this particular morning, he was the only Allied fighter pilot in the sky when the enemy formation appeared. During the previous 8 weeks, Japanese attacks on airfields across northeast India had destroyed 47 transport aircraft on the ground and killed 112 personnel. Adair's P-40, Lulu Belle, marked with the number 44, carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, enough ammunition for roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire. The Japanese force consisted of 24 Mitsubishi K-21 Sally bombers covered by around 40 Nakajima K-43 Oscar fighters positioned in layered formations above and below them. Intelligence reports from Burma showed that raids of this size often achieved a devastating 90% accuracy rate when airfields were undefended. Directly beneath Adair lay Dinjan Airfield, home to 14 fully loaded C-47 transports carrying critical supplies for Chiang Kai-shek's forces, a field hospital treating 63 wounded soldiers, and fuel reserves needed to support Hump operations for the next 11 days. If the bombers made it through unchallenged, those supply lines could be crippled for weeks. The nearest friendly fighters were stationed in Jorhat, 38 minutes away. Adair checked his gauges: full internal tanks, 180 gallons, good for about an hour and a half of combat flying. The enemy formation was 3,000 feet below him, cruising at 240 miles per hour toward the airfield. Standard doctrine warned pilots not to attack when outnumbered more than 5-1. Adair faced 64-1 odds. He could radio for help and shadow the formation, but reinforcements would arrive far too late. By the time anyone else reached the scene, the bombs would already be falling. His only real option was to attack alone and try to break up the bombing run. He shoved the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710 engine surged, manifold pressure rising to 54 inches, the P-40 accelerating past 320 miles per hour. Adair climbed to a position 4,000 feet above the bomber stream, approaching from the south with the sun at his back. The Oscar fighters still hadn't spotted him. Every Japanese pilot in the formation was fixed on the target ahead. For the moment, Adair had one advantage: surprise. They expected defenders over the airfield, not 20 miles out. His plan was simple: strike the lead bomber group first, ignore the fighters as long as possible, and throw the formation into confusion. Break their accuracy, force them to scatter, prevent a coordinated bombing run. The lead Sally formation flew in a tight pattern, 6 aircraft arranged in 2 neat V-shapes of 3. Adair rolled inverted, dropped his nose, and dove toward them from their 7 o'clock high position. His airspeed shot up, 340, then 360 miles per hour. The Allison engine screamed. Closing in fast, he waited until the range fell to 800 yards before firing. 6 Brownings roared, tracers slashing across the sky and ripping into the lead bomber's left wing. Fabric peeled away, metal flashed, and the port engine erupted in flame. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The formation immediately broke apart, bombers scattering wildly. Adair yanked his P-40 upward, absorbing 7 Gs, then rolled right. 40 Oscar fighters were now diving toward him. The Nakajima K-43 Oscar was one of the most agile fighters of the Pacific War. With an 1,150 horsepower engine and exceptional turning performance boosted by its butterfly combat flaps, it could outmaneuver any American fighter in a dogfight. Over the previous 6 months, Oscars had downed 63 Allied aircraft in Burma and northeast India. Adair's P-40N was faster in a straight line, powered by an Allison V1710 engine capable of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet, but it couldn't match an Oscar in a turning fight. Standard P-40 tactics were clear. Never try to turn with them. Hit once, break away, use speed, and reset the engagement. But Adair couldn't afford to disengage. If he ran, the bombers would reform and strike Dinjan. He needed to keep the formation disorganized at all costs. The first 4 Oscars approached in a loose finger 4 formation from his 10 o'clock high position. Adair rolled left, pulled up, and fired a 2-second burst, but his rounds went high. The lead Oscar broke right, dragging his wingman with him. Adair reversed direction, diving to regain speed, just as 2 more Oscars dropped toward him from above. At 400 yards, he pulled into a climbing left turn and fired again, still no hits. His ammunition gauge showed about 800 rounds left, enough for roughly 6 more bursts of fire. Meanwhile, the Sally bombers behind the fighter screen were struggling to reform. 3 groups of 6 were attempting to pull themselves back into their attack formation. If they succeeded, the bombing run would continue. Adair estimated he had no more than 90 seconds before they reached their release point. He leveled out, rammed the throttle fully forward, and dove again straight toward the bombers. 8 Oscars followed him down, but the P-40 picked up speed rapidly. 395 miles per hour, 390 miles per hour. The Japanese fighters couldn't match that dive, and Adair prepared to attack again, alone against 64 enemy aircraft. Adair widened the distance, leveled off at the bomber's altitude, and swung into position behind the right-hand Sally formation. At 300 yards, he opened fire, his tracers stitching across the sky and converging on the lead bomber's starboard engine. The Mitsubishi HA-101 radial detonated in a brilliant fireball, sending the aircraft rolling sharply to the right, shedding flames and debris. The bomber beside it broke formation to avoid colliding with the burning wreck. Adair kicked the rudder, skidding left to line up another target. His rounds punched straight through the thin aluminum skin of the next Sally. The Ki-21 had no armor, no protective plating for the crew, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Designed in 1936, it was thoroughly outdated by 1943, but capable of delivering over a ton of bombs, more than enough to obliterate Dinjan Airfield. 12 Oscars were closing on him again. Adair glanced at his gauges. 162 gallons of fuel left, around 650 rounds remaining. The bombers were now only 19 miles from Dinjan. They would reach their drop point in about 4 minutes. Then another problem hit him. The engine was overheating. The Allison V1710-81 relied on liquid coolant circulating through the cylinder heads and engine block, carrying heat to the radiator nestled beneath the fuselage. At high manifold pressures, anything above 50 inches, the engine ran scorching hot. The cooling system was designed to handle full combat power for about 20 minutes. Adair had already been running at maximum output for 11. His coolant temperature was at 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal was 210. At 250, engine failure would begin. He had 3 choices: pull back the power to cool the engine, abort the fight and retreat, or keep going and risk losing the engine over Japanese-controlled territory. The bombers were still closing. They were still within effective bombing range. The threat remained. Adair kept the throttle pushed forward. 2 Oscars charged straight at him. Their combined closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. They opened fire at 500 yards, streams of 7.7 millimeter tracers reaching for his nose. Adair fired back, his heavier .50 caliber rounds carrying far more punch. At 350 yards, his bullets tore into the lead Oscar's engine cowling. The fragile aircraft shuddered and broke left, trailing white coolant vapor. The wingman followed it out of the fight. Adair rolled right and dove. His coolant temperature hit 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sallies were now 15 miles from Dinjan.
Two bomber formations had managed to regroup into proper V-shapes, while the third was still scattered. Three bombers were struggling to rejoin. He committed once more to breaking the lead formation. 6 Oscars lunged at him, but at 390 miles per hour, he simply dove past them. They couldn't follow. Leveling out at the bomber's altitude, he fired again. His first burst struck the lead sally at the wing root. The structural failure was immediate. The outer wing panel snapped upward and tore clean off. The bomber flipped inverted and fell into a spinning plunge. No parachutes appeared. The crew was doomed. The formation collapsed again, splitting into 3 different directions. Their bombing accuracy was shattered. Even if they dropped their payloads now, the bombs would scatter over miles of jungle rather than strike the airfield. Adair pulled sharply upward. His coolant temperature had climbed to 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine vibrated so violently he could feel it through the control stick. Pre-ignition had begun. The cylinders were detonating too early due to extreme heat. If he didn't reduce power soon, the engine would seize completely. 8 Oscars dropped on him from above. He saw them too late. He rolled left, but not fast enough. A burst of 7.7 millimeter fire ripped through his right wing, tearing fabric and buckling metal. One round smashed through the right aileron control rod, leaving the aircraft sluggish and unresponsive on that side. Another burst struck his fuselage. Sparks danced across the engine cowling. One round pierced the coolant tank behind the firewall. A spray of green coolant splashed across his windscreen. The temperature gauge soared past 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam billowed from the cowling seams. Oil pressure plummeted. The Allison engine was dying. Adair chopped the throttle. RPM dropped from 3,000 to 2,400. Far too little to maintain altitude. The P-40 began sinking, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500 feet. Above him, the Oscars circled, waiting for him to crash or bail out. Then the engine ignited. A fire in a liquid-cooled engine follows a predictable pattern. Overheated coolant vapor vaporizes and catches fire first. The flames move forward, drawn by airflow along the cowling. If the flames reach the fuel lines on the left side of the engine, the aircraft can explode. Adair estimated he had 30 seconds before that happened. By standard procedure, he should have shut the engine off immediately and bailed out, but he was at only 8,000 feet, dropping fast, and still 12 miles from friendly territory. The jungle below was crawling with Japanese patrols. Bailing out meant almost certain capture. He refused to abandon the aircraft. The Allison's fuel mixture could be controlled manually. Adair pulled the mixture lever all the way back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The flames shrank. He pushed the lever forward again. The engine sputtered, coughed, then caught, barely. It was running rough and weak, producing maybe 60% of its normal power, enough to keep him in level flight, but not enough to climb. He would have to fly home with a burning, crippled engine, or not make it at all. Meanwhile, the bomber force was now 13 miles from Dinjan. They were still close enough to attack, but their formations were completely shattered. Individual sallies were already turning southeast toward Burma. The raid had collapsed. The airfield was safe. Adair gently banked southwest toward his base at Naguli, 43 miles away.
He had roughly 15 minutes of airtime left, assuming the engine continued running at all. 6 Oscars stayed on his tail. At 7,000 feet, the oil pressure gauge suddenly dropped to 0. The Allison engine depended entirely on pressurized oil to keep its crankshaft, connecting rods, and camshaft from eating themselves alive. Without lubrication, metal scraped directly against metal. Friction generated heat. Heat caused expansion. Sooner or later, something would seize. Adair could feel the vibration intensifying through the airframe. The propeller no longer turned smoothly. It windmilled in uneven pulses. Power dropped again. His airspeed sagged to 180 miles per hour. The P-40 stalled at 120. His margin between controlled flight and aerodynamic collapse was shrinking fast.
The Oscars behind him crept in to 400 yards. They still didn't fire. They didn't need to. They were waiting, watching for the engine to die, for him to bail out or auger into the jungle. One Oscar eased up alongside him, close enough for Adair to see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot pointed downward. A command: land, surrender, give up. Adair refused to look at him. At 6,000 feet, smoke began pouring into the cockpit, not from the engine fire, but from the electrical system smoldering behind the instrument panel. The rounds that had torn through his fuselage had severed control cables and scorched wiring. Acrid smoke seared his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy back. The slipstream blasted most of the smoke away, but the rush of air made breathing difficult. His airspeed bled to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars drifted farther back. They had already decided he was finished. Why waste ammunition? They simply circled above him, watching his slow descent into the jungle. At 4,000 feet, the right aileron control cable snapped. The aileron instantly deflected full down. The Warhawk rolled violently right and pitched forward into a dive. Adair hauled back on the stick with both hands. Nothing. The elevator cables were damaged too. He had no pitch authority left. The nose stayed stubbornly down as the airspeed rose. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. The jungle canopy surged upward. Altitude, 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,400. He was seconds away from impact. Then, an idea hit him. The broken aileron was forcing the right wing downward. The damaged elevator, stuck in a nose-down trim, was accelerating the dive. Combined with gravity, the aircraft was locked in a death spiral. But aerodynamics are reversible. If he rolled the aircraft inverted, the same broken aileron would force the right wing up instead of down, and the stuck elevator that shoved the nose downward would now push the tail downward, lifting the nose up. Flying upside down would reverse the effect of the damage. The very forces that were killing him upright might save him inverted. At just 1,800 feet above the trees, Adair rolled the P-40, fully inverted. -1G slammed him against his shoulder harness. Blood rushed to his head, vision tinting red at the edges. The fuel system, designed for positive G loads, struggled to feed fuel while upside down. The Allison sputtered, coughed, nearly quit, then caught again, running horribly rough, but producing just enough power. The nose came up. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the upside-down P-40 leveled out, holding 140 miles per hour. Adair flew inverted for 40 agonizing seconds. His airspeed crept to 160. He was climbing, barely, maybe 50 feet per minute, but climbing. Then, the fuel flow stumbled again. The engine began cutting out. He rolled upright. Immediately, the broken controls shoved the nose downward, and he began losing altitude again, 600 feet per minute. Adair held steady until he dropped 300 feet, then rolled inverted once more. The nose lifted. He regained 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him upright again. He repeated the cycle: inverted to climb, upright to let fuel feed, flip, climb, flip, descend, again and again. High above, the 6 Oscars watched in stunned disbelief. An American P-40, engine burning, controls failing, climbing through sheer willpower by flying alternately upside down and right side up, like a wounded animal refusing to die. One Oscar finally dove to investigate. Adair saw him coming, rolled inverted for lift, then snapped upright directly into the Japanese fighter's path. The Japanese pilot panicked and broke away. Whatever the Americans were feeding this pilot, he wasn't normal. The Japanese fighters decided he wasn't worth the trouble. They turned east and disappeared toward Burma. Adair kept inching his way toward Nguli. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons left. His oil pressure had been at 0 for 9 straight minutes. By all mechanical logic, the engine should have seized solid. The connecting rods should have welded themselves to the crankshaft, but the Allison kept turning on inertia, friction, and whatever microscopic oil residual remained. He climbed to 3,000 feet, then 4,000. Nguli was now 21 miles southwest, about 11 minutes away if the engine didn't quit. The coolant temperature gauge had melted so badly the needle had fallen off. Smoke continued pouring from the cowling, though the visible flames had died. Either the fire had burned itself out or the lack of coolant had choked it. At 5,000 feet, he finally spotted Nguli Airfield, the runway, the tower, the revetments, safety. But a new problem surfaced. The landing gear was hydraulic, dependent on engine-driven pressure. The engine was barely producing power now. It could quit at any moment. If he lowered the gear and the engine died, he'd crash short of the runway. If he belly landed with fuel still aboard, the P-40 might burst into flames. He needed the gear down before the engine quit, but lowering it might kill him. His right hand was trembling from carbon monoxide exposure. 14 minutes of breathing toxic fumes had weakened him. He pulled the landing gear handle, nothing. No pressure. The system operated at 1,000 psi, but with the dying engine barely turning to hydraulic pump, there wasn't enough pressure to lower the gear. The P-40 had a backup, a manual hand pump on the left side of the cockpit. 28 full strokes would generate enough hydraulic pressure to drop the gear. Adair grabbed the pump with his left hand, keeping his right on the stick. He pumped. 1, 2, 3. No movement. The pump required both hands for full force, but letting go of the stick meant losing control entirely. His damaged control surfaces would send the aircraft plunging nose first. So, he improvised. Reaching behind the seat, he pulled his lap belt loose, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and cinched it tight. The jury-rigged setup held the stick roughly in neutral. Not ideal, but stable enough. Now he had both hands free. He started pumping furiously. 5 strokes, 10 strokes, 15 strokes. At stroke 23, he felt resistance. At 28, he heard a metallic thunk under the cockpit. The left gear locked. 3 seconds later, the right main gear followed. The aircraft instantly grew draggy. Gear down drag pulled his airspeed from 160 to 135. Still above stall speed, but not by a large margin. The engine was producing maybe 40% power now. It was barely enough to hold altitude. Nguli runway lay 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. His vision tunneled. The edges turned gray. Carbon monoxide was fogging his brain. He shook his head violently and forced his eyes to focus. 6 miles. His one working temperature gauge showed 310 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the engine, metal was swelling, tolerances closing. At any second, a piston could seize, a valve could stick, or a connecting rod could snap. 5 miles. The tower crew at Nguli saw him, saw the smoking, wobbling P-40 with its gear down, crawling toward the runway.
The ground crew at Nguli assumed he would make a standard approach, drop the flaps, slow down, touch down on the main wheels first. But the P-40's flaps were also hydraulically operated. With the engine barely producing enough power to keep the hydraulic pump alive, he could choose either landing gear or flaps, not both. He had already spent the last of the pressure on the gear. The flaps stayed locked up. A no-flap landing meant coming in much faster, about 120 miles per hour instead of the usual 90. That required a longer rollout. Nguli's strip was only 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing and a damaged fighter needed nearly 3,000 feet of usable runway. It was possible, but only if he could maintain speed and glide smoothly all the way in. 2 miles from the runway, the engine finally gave out. The propeller wound down and stopped. The P-40 instantly became a glider, a very poor one. A Warhawk's best glide ratio was roughly 8 to 1. From 2,000 feet, that gave him about 3 miles of travel. The runway was 2 miles away. On paper, that worked, but his aircraft wasn't on paper. Bullet holes riddled the wings and fuselage. Airflow was turbulent. Drag was enormous. His real glide ratio was closer to 6-to-1. He wasn't going to reach the runway, not even close. After outmaneuvering 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying inverted for 11 minutes with a dying engine, after nursing that same engine for nearly 15 more, he was about to crash a few hundred yards short of safety. Then he remembered something, a stray comment from flight school, a detail about the P-40's glide behavior when inverted. Normally, an aircraft glides nose low, wings producing lift as gravity pulls it downward. But inverted, the wings camber reverses. The lift acts downward, and at certain angles of attack, the total drag can actually be lower in normal flight. In theory, an inverted glide could stretch out a few hundred extra yards. No instructor ever expected a pilot to use it. But Adair was out of options. At about 1,800 feet, 1 mile short of the runway, he rolled the Warhawk upside down. Blood flooded into his head. His vision tinted green at the edges. The jungle canopy seemed to float above him or below him, the horizon twisting in impossible directions. But the airspeed held at 125 miles per hour. His descent rate eased to 500 feet per minute, better than the 700 feet per minute he'd been sinking while upright. From the control tower, airmen stared at the spectacle of an upside-down P-40, gear down, smoke trailing from the cowling. Landing gear extended while upside down was aerodynamically absurd and structurally dangerous. The gear doors were built to handle airflow from below, not from above. But somehow the landing gear held. The inverted approach continued. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, a crew chief, spotted the upside-down fighter through his binoculars, gear down, smoke trailing from the cowling. His first instinct was that a Japanese pilot had stolen a P-40 and was making a strafing run. Martinez sprinted to the nearest .50 caliber gun emplacement, 3 men running after him. They swung the heavy machine gun toward the approaching aircraft. Adair was now at 400 feet, half a mile from the runway, still inverted. His consciousness was fading. His vision narrowed to gray tunnels. Between the carbon monoxide and the negative G-forces, his mind was shutting down. He had about 20 seconds left before he blacked out. He had to roll upright, aligned with the runway, and land. But rolling too early meant the damaged controls would shove the nose down and he'd crash short. Rolling too late meant that he'd overshoot the runway entirely. At 200 feet, 300 yards from the edge of the field, Adair finally rolled upright. The wounded aileron instantly yanked the right wing down. He fought back, forcing the stick left. The nose dipped, he hauled back. The elevator cables responded sluggishly, giving him only partial authority. But it was enough. Barely. The P-40 came in steep, nose high, wings trembling. Martinez's machine gun crew tracked the fighter. It might be Japanese, it might be American. They had 3 seconds to decide whether to fire. Martinez held his men back. Adair crossed the runway threshold at 90 feet and dropping fast. Too fast. Too steep. The Warhawk fell the last 90 feet in 4 seconds. The main gear slammed onto the concrete with a brutal 7G impact. The struts bottomed out. The tailwheel smashed down. Metal howled in protest. The right main gear gave out. The wing dropped and dug into the runway. The P-40 whipped into a violent ground loop, spinning more than 180 degrees, throwing up sparks and shards of concrete. It skidded backward for nearly 200 feet before grinding to a stop. Smoke poured from the engine bay. The fire crew sprinted toward the wreck. Adair didn't move for 12 long seconds. Then he finally unlatched his harness, pushed himself upright, and climbed out onto the wing. His leads collapsed. He caught himself against the wing root as ground crew rushed up and lifted him down. Martinez arrived with the firefighters. They pulled open the shattered cowling. When the fire crews pried open the ruined cowling, the extent of the damage became obvious. The Allison engine was finished, every piston seized solid. The crankshaft twisted and warped, the oil pan split open, and coolant splattered across every surface. Adair walked around the wreck with Sergeant Martinez, taking stock of what the Warhawk had endured. They counted 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 more in the right wing and 4 in the left. One round had completely severed the right aileron control cable. Another had punched through the hydraulic reservoir. A third had sliced straight through 2 electrical harnesses behind the instrument panel. The engine had suffered catastrophic internal failure from the overheating and oil starvation. Scored cylinders, 3 connecting rods welded to the crankshaft, and a coolant system beyond repair. Lulu Belle would never fly again, but Philip Adair had kept Dinjan Airfield alive. Intelligence reports later confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had abandoned their attack without releasing a single bomb. 15 miles short of their target, the Japanese formation had dissolved into chaos. 40 Oscar fighters escorted empty bombers back to Burma. Not a single bomb struck Allied installations. No personnel on the ground were injured. All 14 C-47 transports remained intact, and the H-Hump airlift continued without the slightest disruption. 3 days later, on December 16, 1943, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the fight. He explained the attack sequence, how he managed to fly inverted with crippled controls, and how he pulled off the approach and landing. Flight surgeons examined him and discovered that even 72 hours after the mission, his blood still carried elevated carbon monoxide levels. According to their assessment, he should have lost consciousness during the last 11 minutes of the flight. Sheer force of will had kept him functioning. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India Theater, personally awarded 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities." Adair went on to fly 95 additional combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group. He earned ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned home in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 3 decades, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, the famed Burma Banshees, continued operations until August 1945. They destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and another 147 on the ground, losing 63 pilots killed or missing. Their death's head insignia became one of the most iconic symbols in the entire China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the legendary reputation of the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower, struggled about 15,000 feet, and was considered outdated by 1943. But in the hands of pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved that combat wasn't won on performance charts, it was won by the grit and determination of the person flying the aircraft. One pilot, one obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. On December 13, 1943, Philip Adair showed the world that impossible odds mean nothing to someone who refuses to give up. His solution to his crippled controls, alternating between inverted and upright flight for 11 minutes, defied every rule in the flight manual. His inverted gear-down approach had never been attempted before and has never been repeated since. That was the spirit of the Burma Banshees, and the day a single P-40 pilot unraveled an entire Japanese air raid. If stories like this remind you why history matters, consider liking the video, subscribing for more forgotten heroes, and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the CBI theater.